We are going through Hebrews chapter 11. We began to go through Hebrews chapter 11 on Tuesday evenings when we started our New Year's series that took us through January and February on the power of faith. And we haven't got long to go in Hebrews chapter 11. We have two more sessions before we cover Hebrews 11. And what we're doing is looking at the author of Hebrews and how he is trying to encourage his Jewish congregation, that a Jewish congregation that had come under severe pressure and were under pressure to leave the Christian faith and go back to the Old Testament Jewish faith. That way they would be received back into synagogues. Their businesses would thrive again in the Jewish community that had cast them out. And what the message of Hebrews is don't go back, because what you have in Jesus and the new covenant is so much better that it's even worth facing difficulty in this life, because in the end, not only will you receive God's blessing in this life, but in the end, you will go to heaven and you will have an eternal reward. So in Hebrews 11, the author is showing these mainly Jewish Christians that there is continuity between faith in the Old Testament and New Testament, and that in fact everybody lives by faith, whether you're Old Testament, New Testament. All that matters to God, the only thing that pleases God, is faith. And so he chose a number of characters from the Old Testament to say, look, here's an example of faith for you to follow. And we've been going through them. And last week we looked at the faith of Isaac. And tonight we're going to briefly look at the faith of Jacob and the faith of Joseph. And so I'm going to share a scripture with you right now. There we are. By faith, Jacob and Joseph. Now, I've started with Isaac so we can just see the thought that's progressing here. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. We looked at that last week. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. As I've been studying Hebrews chapter 11 with you for these Tuesday evenings, I've studied it before, but I've never gone through it as thoroughly as I have. And one of the best books that I've found on this Hebrews chapter 11 is R.T. Kendall's book called Believing God, which I recommend to you. It's been very helpful to me. And I've been seeing things that are appearing again and again. There's a sense in Hebrews chapter 11 of living our lives in the light of the coming kingdom, the city from above, the New Jerusalem. There's this sense of making decisions to live our lives now in the light of what's in the future that we haven't yet experienced. And last week we looked at Isaac, who blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. And we saw that although Esau was Isaac's favorite, Jacob was not his favorite, and Jacob swindled the blessing from Esau, and so distressed his father that his father couldn't stop shaking when he found out. And Esau came and said, reverse it, reverse it. And Jacob by faith blessed Isaac by faith said, no, he will be blessed, because he believed that God had chosen Jacob and the line of Jacob for the future kingdom purposes. And we briefly looked at Romans 9, reflecting this, that this was God's choice, God's election, and by faith, spiritually, Isaac saw that this was God and refused to act in a worldly, fleshly, self-centered, emotional manner. So then we come to Jacob himself. By faith, Jacob, it says in verse 21 of Hebrews 11, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. It's interesting when you're reading through these characters in Hebrews chapter 11, because with some of them, there's not much on them at all. There's just a sentence, you know, by faith Enoch walked with God and was not, you know, and everything like that. And but the author knew what he was doing. He could have mentioned many things about Jacob. Jacob had a rich story, didn't he? He's one of the most interesting stories in the Old Testament. But much of what Jacob did was not faith at all. It was manipulation. It was human effort to achieve the plans of God rather than faith and patience. And when Jacob came, and it says, by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. Jacob is at the end of his life, but at the end of his life, something wonderful happens. We know that when we read the story of Jacob, he was absolutely heartbroken when he believed, because his sons had told him that Joseph had been eaten by an animal, and they showed him the bloodied coat. And he said that he would never ever recover from this and never stop mourning. And so for many years he lived in depression and sadness and mourning. He just couldn't get over it. But out of the blue, at the end of his life, not only is he saved and his family saved by Joseph and Joseph's actions under Pharaoh in keeping the grain, but he meets Joseph again, and he also gets to meet his grandchildren. And in this passage, it says a couple of things that are worth noticing. Well, actually, let me read that story for you. Let me read it. Here's the story. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. Well, what happened when he blessed the sons of Joseph? Here we go. Genesis 48, verse 17 to 20. Genesis 48, 17 following. Now, when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. So he took off his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head, who was the oldest. And Joseph said to his father, not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son. I know he also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. So he blessed them that day, saying, by you Israel will bless, saying, may God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh. Thus he set Ephraim before Manasseh. So, interesting, isn't it? We find that in Abraham's life, he had a son of the flesh, Ishmael, and God said, and Abraham loved Ishmael, absolutely adored him, and said to God, oh, that he would live before you. In other words, can Ishmael please be the one that inherits and carries your destiny, your promise forward? And God said, no, Isaac. And then we've got Isaac, who loved Esau, far more, favored him far more than he did Jacob, who did terrible things. And yet we see that God says, no, Esau I've hated, Jacob I have loved, and I have chosen him, even though he is a rascal. And Isaac recognized it and by faith blessed him. Now we see that Jacob has found Joseph, and now Joseph is saying, whoa, 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 and not happy. It says it displeased him. You're blessing the wrong one. But here we find that now Jacob is following what the Holy Spirit is leading. It says, by faith, when he was dying, he blessed each of the sons of Joseph, by faith. So he could tell that God had a purpose that Joseph couldn't see. And so we're seeing this sort of like coming back again and again, aren't we? That God does not always work through human preferences, human wisdom, human tradition, human nepotism, and human politics, if I can put it that way. These three men, none of it went according to the natural plan. And this is so important, I think, to the author of Hebrews, because he's wanting the people to know that it's not by physical descent that you're a child of God, but by spiritual descent, that Abraham is the spiritual father of all who believe, both Jew and Gentile. It's not to do with physical human lineage, but it's to do with God's spirit and God's promise. And he can choose whoever he wants to carry the promise through. He can bring a miraculous Isaac. He can choose the manipulative Jacob. He can bless the younger of Joseph's son. Something is coming through here again and again, that God works through his spirit independently of human religion, if I can put it that way, human thinking, human desire, human expectation, and human preference. These men, they had to move by faith. They had to step out of their human thinking, human desires, human passions, human traditions, human expectations, human rationalizing. They had to step out of it and by faith embrace something that came from God, that was spiritual and led by the Holy Spirit, and that went contrary to their fleshly desires. When I say fleshly, I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean their normal human desires and way of viewing things. They had to, by faith, step out of the natural and believe in the spiritual and be led in an Old Testament way by the Spirit of God and not by human traditions. Well, the story of the Christian church is one of God moving in his Spirit, people discerning God moving in his Spirit, and then people taking what God had moved in his Spirit and making it natural religion again, either politicized or religiousized or traditionalized or human succession. That's the story of the church. That God will move in the Spirit, people will respond to the Spirit, it'll come out of nowhere with people who are nobodies, but then it will have its results, and the second, third, fourth, fifth generations have a tendency to no longer follow the Spirit, but the form that's left when the Spirit first moved. And that's what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing here. So Jacob blessed, and then he worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. I like, why would, in this short verse, why would the author of Hebrews mention that he worshipped and mentioned that he was leaning on the top of his staff? All the things he could have said about Joseph, and it's the faith of the blessing that carries the spiritual line. And it's the leaning on the top of his staff, and it's the worshipping. Well, I know he was old, but why did also Jacob need to lean on a staff? He had a staff long before he was old. Do you remember what happened? God hit him in the hip socket. Do you remember? When he wrestled with God, and his name was changed to Israel, a prince with God. And from that moment, he walked with a limp. He walked with a limp. He had encountered God, and God had touched him, and he was forever disabled. But out of that disability that caused him to have a staff came destiny, I've heard preachers talk about Isaac and wrestling with God and getting up, having wrestled with God with the blessing and walking away with a limp. And they sort of say in a preaching style, never trust a Christian that doesn't walk with a limp. And that's quite a good phrase, because of course what they mean is never trust a Christian that hasn't wrestled with God, and come through into a place of maturity. Those that are arrogant, before that point, Jacob was so arrogant. I mean, who does he think he is to wrestle with God in the first place? Who does he think he is? So God had to teach him. But after that, every step he took, it was a limp. He needed a staff, and it was a reminder that his weakness was God's strength. And so here he is leaning on that staff. But also, I read that leaning on the staff, and the staff also talks a little bit about reflection. Sometimes you see pictures of people and they've been walking and they found a beautiful view and they've got their walking stick and they're just sort of leaning on their stick, thinking, looking at the stream, looking out at the mountain, and they're just leaning on their stick, reflecting. And this is a time of reflecting and worship. It says by faith, Jacob, when he was dying. So now he's looking back and he's worshiping. What a wonderful thing. Before he was mourning. He wouldn't be consoled. But now he is worshiping the Lord. There's this sense that at the end of his life, he's seen the goodness of God. His son, metaphorically, came back to life as far as he was concerned. His grandchildren. And what a beautiful ending for a Jacob who said to Pharaoh when he first met him, the days of my life have been hard, evil, and short. But now he could look back and he could see that everything God had wanted to do was done despite him. And then in the next verse, we come to Joseph. And unlike Jacob, whose life is marred by human effort, trying to get God's promise by human manipulation, Joseph's life was astonishing, wasn't it? Okay, he might have been a bit arrogant in his early years, maybe shouldn't have shared those dreams, but then why shouldn't he have shared them? God gave them to him. And then we see him in Potiphar's house, and every time he gets his life going again, it gets knocked down. He's put in prison for rape that he didn't commit, and he has dreams, and the people he gave the dreams to forget him. And we know the story. And eventually, through dreams, he becomes second only to Pharaoh in Egypt and becomes the hero of the ancient world. A hero of Egypt, saving them, making them rich through his understanding of how to keep the grain and sell it, and also saves his family and therefore the future of the Israeli people through his obedience. So there's so many things we could say. By faith, he refused Potiphar, By faith, he was in prison. But here again, look. By faith, when he was dying, he made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. So the author of Hebrews chooses this, not all the wonderful things that he did. By faith, he had a dream, and by faith, he did this. But by faith, that he said, make sure my bones go to the promised land when you depart from Egypt. So let me just read that from Genesis 50, verse 24 following. Gives the context to the Hebrews reference. And Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So what are we learning from the faith of Joseph? Well, first of all, by faith, he prophetically saw that his people would return to the promised land. But not only did he see that the people would return to the promised land, but he also identified with the future people that God would bring out of Egypt. And I think this is really powerful and reminds us, I think, a little bit about Abraham, and also about Moses, who we'll look at next week. Because Abraham, he left his family and his home to go to the promised land. And we also read in Hebrews that we looked at this a few weeks ago, that Abraham never built a city. There's no city of Abraham. There is a city of David, but there's no city of Abraham. He lived in tents, even as somebody who was passing through the promised land. He camped and never made a city. And the Hebrews author says, because he was looking for another city, the city of God, the Jerusalem above that was to come. Amazing. Well, look, Joseph was an Egyptian hero. He was second only to Pharaoh. I mean, he was aristocracy. He'd married into the Egyptian line. I mean, you would have thought that nobody would be more comfortable than Joseph in Egypt, more celebrated in Egypt than Joseph, more wealthy than anybody there in Egypt. He was absolutely adored and loved. The Egyptians were so grateful to him. But look, he's saying, I'm dying, but I don't identify with being here. I know I'm dying, but I don't even want my bones to stay here. I want you to remember whenever this takes place, and it was hundreds of years later, I don't want to stay here. I don't want to rest here. I want to go to where God has promised that we will be a people. That's where I want to be. Yeah, but you're an Egyptian hero. You've got an Egyptian name, all these types of things. In fact, I watched a documentary. They actually found the tomb of Joseph in Egypt, and in that tomb they saw not a full figure, but there was a figure of a person that was there. They discovered that it was that the name was Joseph's Egyptian name, and he had the honors that he would have had and the remembrance that he had had of what he did. And they could even trace that there was a faint, this statue had been painted, and they could even trace that he had red hair. How about that? David had red hair. Remember, I got some Jewish friends, and some of my Jewish friends have red hair. And it just amazes me, because I look at their red hair and I think, red-haired Jews, and I think, wow. I mean, naturally speaking, that runs right back to Joseph, and I've got a book on that, a book with pictures. It's wonderful. Anyway, I digress, but it is interesting. So, and the body wasn't there. The body wasn't there, and it wasn't that it was stolen by thieves. It was that he'd said, "I want to go with you." So amazing that he didn't identify with all his success, all his wealth, all his fame. He identified with God's future, the people that were to come, the promise of God. And that was by faith. By faith, it says, that he said, take my bones. And imagine the impact his faith had on people in his own generation. They had just come out, this small clan, these 12 brothers had just come out of the promised land and were so grateful to be in Egypt. And they were probably thinking, isn't this good? We've been forgiven by Joseph. And now we can enjoy Egypt with him protecting us, you know. But now when he's dying, he says, there's nothing here for me. I don't even want my bones to be here. Imagine him saying to all those uh, Israelites, to the 10 tribes that were now marrying, having children, grandchildren. Joseph saw his grandchildren. I'm sure all the other brothers were having grandchildren and marriage. And we know that hundreds of years there would be, thousands and thousands and thousands of multiplied. In fact, they were multiplying so powerfully, Pharaoh couldn't cope with them, could he? He just and they were saying these Jewish women, they give birth too quickly for us. All that to come. But if they'd remembered these words of Joseph, then during that time as slaves, they had a witness that God was going to do something, and those bones would be taken back. So as I close, I think we're seeing the fact that people here are making decisions by faith and the Holy Spirit that are sometimes counterintuitive, intellectual, counter-cultural with the firstborns, counter-natural and preference. Well, I would prefer it to be like this, God, but you want it in a different way. Surprising, God's choice, and spiritual. So we can see that the lesson for us to live in our life is to be spiritual, to believe by faith, not to take Christianity and make it some sort of natural religion. There's so much Christianity that claims to be Christianity out. There's nothing more than natural religion. Nothing more than natural religion. I take an example. I'm not having to go at Roman Catholics, but the way that they would choose one pope and then another pope, I mean, it was just pure politics. I mean, it had nothing to do with any type of leadership. It was, and the bishops, you would have to politic to become a bishops, and the bishops were chosen overseas not because they were filled with the Spirit, but because, they were from this place or that place or knew that sort of person, and all these types of things. And it can happen in charismatic churches that begin in the Spirit, and then after a while they become natural. We can begin in the Spirit. The Galatians began in the Spirit and ended up in the flesh or in the natural. So we can become dull to God's plan. We can become too natural. We can turn God's Spirit into natural Christianity or religion and have a form of godliness that denies its power, its spirit. So there's a lot here for us. And then also, as well as that, the walking by faith, the being ready to go with the Spirit, even when it's against our human desires. We also see this picture of the future, the future determining the present. It's the future. I'm going to bless this child, not that child, because of the future. The future is in this line. The future is here. And I'm going to make decisions now because of the future. I'm not going to build a city. I'm Abraham because of the future. I'm not going to have my bones left here in Egypt because of the future. Wait till you see Moses next. Moses as well. He was a great hero. A great prince of Egypt, But it says that he counted it as rubbish compared to the calling of God. He saw the future, he saw the destiny, and gave up the material, human ease of the moment to follow the future of God. He was prepared to be counted amongst the slaves for the glory of God. And it's the same with the others that we'll see a week after next. The others, when it just talks about Gideon and all these types of people who, again, separated themselves from the natural and had their eye on God's future promise. So we'll leave it at that tonight. Thank you, Pastor Dorian.